Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. Thank you for attending. My name is Yvette Cozier. I'm the Assistant Dean of Diversity and Inclusion at Boston University School of Public Health. And along with my colleagues, Dr. Emelia Benjamin, who's the Associate Provost of Faculty Development and Diversity for the medical campus, and Dr. Rafael Ortega, who is Associate Dean for Diversity and Multicultural Affairs for the School of Medicine, I would like to welcome you to our new discussion series, Disagreeing on Difficult Issues. So at the School of Public Health and the medical campus in general, we aspire to generate understanding through accumulation of facts, but also through dialogue and debate. And in these very divided times, it's more important than ever to have spaces where complex, competing ideas can be discussed in the context of civility and respect, and really underscoring civility and respect. In other words, our goal as a university is to provide that space where we can have these very difficult conversations without being difficult to each other. We can engage with new perspectives, take on challenging issues, and especially the ones that generate passionate opinion and disagreement. So this discussion series is meant to help create the space for these types of discussions here on the medical campus. So as we know, there are no shortage of topics that can fill this space. But today we begin with the topic of sexual harassment. But first, I would like to introduce our speaker and our moderator for the afternoon. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Carol Rivers, Professor of Journalism at Boston University College of Communication. Professor Rivers is a nationally known author, journalist, and columnist who's been reporting about American life and politics, including the civil rights movement, the Kennedy presidency, and the women's movement. Her op-eds have appeared in many national publications, including the New York Times, the LA Times, and the Washington Post. And her latest book, her 14th overall, The New Soft War on Women, was an Oprah Top 10 choice. So that always rises right up there, right? Congratulations. It's also my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Kenneth Elmore, Associate Provost and Dean of Students for Boston University. Since 2003, Provost Elmore has coordinated university efforts to provide a safe environment where students can find their way within the vibrant academic community that is Boston University. Of the many offices that report to him, but are not limited to, these include the Howard Thurman Center for Common Ground, Judicial Affairs, and the Community Service Center. So I thank you both for joining us this afternoon. So before I turn it over to Professor Rivers, I just want to emphasize we can have difficult conversations without being difficult to each other. So let's just keep that in mind, and may we have a very spirited conversation. So Professor Rivers?
Great. Well, I'm very much interested in this issue because when I started out as a cub reporter, there were no laws against sexual harassment. There were no laws against sexual discrimination. And basically, young women were sort of up against it to dodge the gropers, the guys who pushed you up against the cabinet, the guys who propositioned you or said, I'll fire you unless ... And my generation often thought this is the way it is and probably the way it will be. But one very interesting thing happened, and I think a lot of people aren't aware, what the Civil Rights Act of 1964, there was a clause outlawing discrimination on the basis of race, national outcome, or religion. And a congressman named Judge Smith, Howard Smith is his name, but he had been a judge, added the words "and sex" to the legislation. And why did he add that? Because he was an arch segregationist and he was trying to get the legislation derailed. It just amazes me that wherever Judge Smith is out there, he must be a little bit disconcerted with the fact that all the civil rights legislation that applies to women have come out of his little trick to try to get the Civil Rights Act derailed. So that was extremely interesting. And then in 1978, I was asked to do one of the first national magazine stories on sexual harassment. It was for Mother Jones, which is still around. And I remember thinking, you know, I remember I'd had my issues. I had a supervisor back me up in his office in a corner and give me the details of a movie called The Devil in Miss Jones, and you can imagine the plot of that one. I managed to slither out, but I thought that for most women it was rather an inconvenience. As I started to do my reporting, I was astonished to find out, just started talking to my friends, that I had one friend who dropped out of college because her professor said if she would get an F if she didn't sleep with him. I had others who lost jobs, pay, and as I started to do my reporting, one of the first case studies that I used was, I started my piece this way. The scenario was right out of a slick TV ad designed to make women buy stockings. The young woman was working at her desk. Two of her male supervisors were standing nearby arguing about which one was going to take her to dinner at the fanciest restaurant. If you believe that gentlemen prefer Hanes commercials, women live for such moments. But this wasn't a stocking ad, and Diane Williams got annoyed. She was working as an information specialist for the Justice Department and was ambitious. I have great aspirations. I'm very achievement-oriented. And she had her own rules. She didn't date any man that she's working for. But her supervisor kept sending her love notes, MASH notes, and then later on, notes that were much more threatening. And he said to her, I don't know what you're trying to do, but if it comes down to a showdown between you and me, you will surely lose because I am the director's boy. Well, it turned out he was a director's boy. And this woman wound up being fired as a malicious gossip from a government department. It took her 5 years to file a suit and to go through the process. And I found this in all the interviews I did. And I remember interviewing one worker who had headed a clerical workers union. And she said, look, the truth is, people think that women sleep their way up all the time, but largely it doesn't happen, because if you're not one of the great courtesans of history, what's going to happen is, you know, somebody's going to find out, the guy's wife is going to find out, and you're going to get fired and not him. So the myth of the sleeping your way up is way, way over-exaggerated. So I think we began to get some traction with some of these stories that came up, and then of course came as you all remember, the Anita Hill case, in which Anita Hill charged Clarence Thomas with sexual harassment. And if you remember some of that testimony, people learned about long dong silver and pubic hairs in Coke cans and other such things. And in fact, Anita Hill's case was dismissed. And the really interesting things was the white Democrats on the committee were extremely uncomfortable about this because, of course, it involved a black Supreme Court justice and a black woman in the case. They wanted basically to get rid of it as fast as they can, which in force is exactly what they did. And then what we're seeing, finally, the Supreme Court did agree that sex discrimination, that sexual harassment was sex discrimination. And my thought was that, okay, things are going to go fine. We're going to move right on from here. Quite clearly, that didn't happen. There's a really interesting recent study by about 1,000 job discrimination cases by two law professors, Sandra Sperino at the University of Cincinnati and Suja Thomas at the University of Illinois. And they sort of set out to look at how judges view discrimination cases. And what they found was that judges frequently dismiss harassment cases that most likely meet the requirements under the law. And they say, sadly, that in the past 40 years, federal judges across the country have developed an extremely narrow interpretation of what sexual harassment is under the law and what behaviors create a hostile work environment. Repeated groping, sexual propositions, and sexualized comments at work don't usually meet that high standard. It's shocking, said Sperino. You read about women being groped or rubbed against a lot at work, and judges don't think that creates a hostile work environment. So one reason that you see all these women now coming out into the press is because the courts have done a really terrible job about, you know, bringing out sexual harassment. And we're seeing from the cases that are coming up that we have network anchors who've been assaulted by network heads. We have, you know, hundreds of women who have been assaulted by at this point allegedly assaulted by the comedian Bill Cosby. We have Harvey Weinstein, who faces many, many allegations about the sort of casting couch kind of things. But, you know, it's not just the celebrities that are involved in these cases. It's waitresses, it's Uber drivers, it's people who clean up hotel rooms, it's secretaries. And we find that very often the best that these women can do is file a complaint, and sometimes they get, the complaint is dismissed, sometimes they get to sign an agreement. If they shut up, they will keep their job or get paid a little bit of money, and they're basically being paid to go away. And I think rarely did many Americans understand the incredible toll that sexual harassment was being paid by women in terms of money, in terms of PTSD cases. And I've just been doing some recent research that shows that women's sense of authenticity is really damaged by having to face these repeated sexual harassment issues, because, you know, if you're trying to go into work and be who you are, and you sort of have to spend your time smiling and being nice to people because you're afraid of what's coming down the road, or if they do make an advance, that you have to try to avoid it, and you wind up in a very bad psychological state. So what we're seeing is that sexual harassment is a major issue, and the fact that it's sort of come out now has caused some people to be really frenetic or frantic, I guess you'd say, about it. Steve Bannon, for example, has decreed that 100,000 years of patriarchy is coming to an end because of the Me Too movement. I think he's not very happy about that, being a white supremacist and hardly a feminist. And we're seeing other things emerging from people who are saying, hey, this is a witch hunt, and it's going to target men. It is going to completely create a new and different pressures upon women who are dating. It's going to create pressures. Some women are saying it's going to create pressures on women who are attractive, because they're very much worried that they will not be hired, because they will be seen as somewhere down the line they may make a complaint or file a suit. But I am here to say as a witness that for a long time, sexual harassment has been a major problem in the lives of American women. And I do believe that we need to have due process, that we certainly cannot be making allegations against people who may indeed be innocent. And we can't certainly charge men as a whole, because most men are not harassers. Most men do not discriminate. But for those who are, and those who've been out there, I think one thing that's happened, the time has seemed to have come that this behavior may no longer be protected. Your buddies won't protect you. The law won't protect you. The media will no longer protect you. I mean, it's so interesting that everybody in Hollywood seemed to know what Harvey Weinstein was up to, and nobody said anything. Nobody walked in and said, hey, I'm not going to star in your movie, and I'm a big A-list movie guy, if what's really true is going on. That didn't happen. So I think that for the first time, the people who are predators, and that's really what they've been, are actually getting their come up in some ways. Actually, the law is working as it was intended to work, and what I hope will come out of all of this is a much, first of all, a much clearer set of what the rules are, and two, real protection for women, and real guidelines for men, so that we can behave civilly to each other, understand what's right and what's wrong, and eliminate what's been really a major civil rights evil in our country.
Well, thanks. So I'd love to see if we can just start to talk a little bit. Please join in as you would like to. I think this is an important piece that, you know, I'll start by saying this. Maybe I could just show of hands. How many of you are in deep fear about being in this conversation right now? Go ahead, raise your hand. Deep fear. All right. And how many of you are lying to me right now? And I say that because one of the things that I do is I try to go to real commonplace locations and have conversations with people about the kinds of things you don't want to have conversations about, right? I'm that guy who'll go to a bar in South Boston and say, hey, let's discuss race in America, right? So that kind of thing. And I think, when I come up on this kind of a conversation, the people who I chat with, men and women, but mostly men, are terrified. They are wondering if I'm an investigator or why are you bringing this up as a kind of thing? And no, I don't want to discuss it. What do you think's contributed to us being, and I do think we're in fear about this thing overall. What do you think contributes to it, by the way, including right here at our fair university, right?
I do think that sometimes the rules can be unclear. I mean, I am sympathetic to men who say, gosh, if I say you look nice today, is that wrong? Or they say, if I'm going out on a date, what is yes and what is no? Particularly around universities and campuses, all these issues surface all the time because we have young kids and they're learning the ropes and they're wondering what the ropes are. And I think the consequences now have become real for men when they never were before. They were very real for women for a long time. But I think now these issues have become, the consequences have become very real for men too, and that creates anxiety.
Well, Professor, what do you say to someone who says, oh, come on, you can't tell me you haven't understood how to interact with this other human being over time? Oh, come on. This has been more than clear. Oh, come on. Or even better, good, it's about time you experience and understand the way that I felt about this. I mean, what do you say to some of that sort of stuff where people say, no, 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 this is not about that. The sort of things that we see on the extreme or the extremes and the sort of things that are more commonplace, come on, we know better than that.
Well, I think many people do know better, but many people don't. And many people think that there's some practices that are okay that aren't okay. And I think women and men oftentimes have a different view of what those practices are. And that's where I think we need to talk. You know, what really bothers you in my behavior on the part of men and on the part of men being honest about what I'm scared about. You know, what behavior that I see as innocent could really get me into trouble. And I think those are the kind of discussions that they're hard to have.
Why?
Because they involve such personal and intimate behavior. We're pretty uncomfortable in this country anyhow talking about some of these things and trying to get them now into the realm of politics and media and lawsuits and all that stuff. It amps up the whole discussion to a different level.
Anyone? Question? Thought? Do you think this is just a moment and we will go back the way that we have always gone back? Or will something change? And if so, what will we see that'll be different?
You know, that's interesting because I did think after Anita Hill that things would change. Because there was so much anger among women out there. It was very clear that the parties that I mean, the sad thing was that the people who were supposed to be sympathetic didn't listen to, there were 3 or 4 other women who were bringing charges against Clarence Thomas. And they were kind of shuffled under the rug. And it died, it went away. And I'm hopeful that this is a moment that really will change things, but there is always a possibility that the media cycle will roll, new things will happen, and this will, you know, once again, fade back into obscurity.
So, you know, let's stay with Anita Hill for a sec. Personally, as a black person, that was one of the most painful things that I dealt with. It was just painful because of this connection with race. On a whole lot of fronts, Democrats who were not going to weigh in, people who weren't going to look fully at the issue. Basically, another one of those moments where people said, I am not going to discuss this. I'm going to stay out of it. And I wonder if, you know, when we start to add these other human factors or these ways we look at each other, if that probably contributed to it going absolutely nowhere at all.
I think that's right. When the issue of race was added, so many more things came in, and particularly the people who would have been the natural defenders of an Anita Hill. You know, had it been not Clarence Thomas, but Jonathan Thomas from New England, who had been running for, been the Supreme Court nominee, would that have made it easier for those who saw Anita Hill as righteous in her cause and as telling the truth? Would that have made it easier for them to move forward and to be tougher? And would something perhaps have really emerged out of that? Would Clarence Thomas have been perhaps denied of his seat because of these allegations? So I think race was certainly a big part of it.
And we could have switched it around too.
Absolutely.
Would either one of them got a hearing if the person on the other end was a different race?
Exactly.
You know, you kind of wonder about that, and I think that's where a lot of my pain was about this. They both said things that I said, of course, why of course, and they both said things too that made me bristle a little bit and made me feel like the end was near.
Yes,
kind of thing.
Yes.
Overall. Come on. So any thoughts? Join in, folks. Yes, tell us who you are, please.
Hello. Hi. My name is Lulwa. I'm a VUSPH student. It's my final semester here at VUSPH. And I think something you were mentioning before about why are people scared to talk about these things. Well, the first thing is that, like, right now I'm scared, for example, because I'm worried I'm going to say something that will be misunderstood, and I'm talking to a lot of people, or that I'll say something and offend someone. Or that I'll say something that's kind of stupid, you know, so I'm scared about all of that. But I think one of the reasons people might be scared of having this conversation about sexual assault, and maybe cisgender men specifically, is because in order to have these conversations, you also have to admit that you might have been in a position where you didn't maybe sexually harass someone, but you did something wrong. And that's hard for people to admit because no one wants to think of themselves as a bad person, and they also don't want other people to think of them as bad people. But I think it's more about trying to talk to cisgender men and make them realize that it's not a black and white issue, so it's not either you're a perpetrator or you're not a perpetrator. Like, there are different levels of rape culture, and you don't necessarily have to have assaulted someone to be someone who did something wrong. And I think, just for me personally as a cis woman, one of the reasons I'm scared of having these conversations is, first of all, I'm worried that I still won't be heard, even if I'm talking in this climate, and just the frustration that you're going to feel that you finally have this platform where you can talk, but your opinions are still going to be pushed aside. So I'm also scared about the anger that comes with that. And the idea that, you know, we're talking about having difficult conversations and about how we can remain civil having these conversations, but sometimes you're put in a position where being civil and, like, respectful is very difficult because you have things that are very personal to you that are being challenged, and also things that are very personal to you that are being dismissed. So I also think that's worth talking about, how sometimes it is hard to be respectful and, like, diplomatic, and sometimes it's almost unreasonable, I think, to tell people that you have to maintain this, you know, diplomatic facade when things like sexual harassment are being brought up, especially if you're someone who's a survivor of sexual harassment. So I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about that, about how sometimes there are things that are being talked about and discussed, but that maybe the first priority isn't necessarily to, you know, be calm and cool about it, but it's necessary for people to get angry about it, and that they don't always have to, like, I don't want to say be respectful, but I think they should be able to show their anger over things that are very worthy of being angry about, and people shouldn't call them off and say, well, you're not talking about this in a respectful way, so I don't want to listen to you. So yeah.
So sometimes that civility sounds like it's one more parameter on the conversation, right?
I feel it derails conversations sometimes because people focus on how you're saying things more than what you're saying.
And the other piece too, in terms of what you're saying, what we have to also take into account are plenty of people say, there's no nuance to this conversation.
Yeah.
There are certain ways we need to have this conversation. There's certain words and language that we use with this conversation. And that's just how it's going to be if you're going to have it around me.
Yeah.
I love that you say, let's be human about this. Let's get angry about this. Let's be upset about this. And that is still within the framework of being civil. That's a really interesting way to think about it.
And you know, there's lots of research showing that anger in women is not well received. And to put it mildly, I just read not long ago a Forbes magazine article said that a woman, if she goes into a meeting with males at a corporate setting, that she should never directly criticize a male. She should find a way first how to compliment him, and then she could give a little criticism. So in this kind of climate, when women who are angry are dismissed often, that just adds to the anger. And you're right, that say, you know, screw civility is how you often react to that, because, you know, I'm civil and I get nowhere, and then I get angry and I also get nowhere. So there's a lose-lose scenario. You
know, there's this other piece to it too, where you would think that in a school of public health, a school of medicine, an academic institution, we can just be bare about it. I mean, we see people who are naked, we see people at their worst, we see people on real basic levels, and you would hope that our conversations could be that raw too. But at the same time, too, we want to go on and have professional lives and families, and we also do want to make sure that we have relationships with each other. And so it's finding that fine line, and I think we all have to be able to do that, finding that fine line for how we can be as raw as possible, and at the same time be able to progress a little bit with this. But boys, research like that, man, I feel like a child that someone has to come into my space and treat me like that. How pejorative, and certainly something that women have had to deal with for a long time. Come on, comments, questions. Come on, jump in here, folks. Yes. I think a microphone's coming right over to you.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Jody Abbott. I'm faculty in the Department of OBGYN, and so I'm a women's health specialist and advocate. And we've had a very painful chapter in academic OBGYN that has been very personal for our department, in that one of our graduated residents went to a national professional meeting where she gave her first oral presentation, you know, generally one of the sort of highlights of your early career as an investigator. Following that, the president of the national organization gave a talk where he made several derogatory comments about women and this women's health organization, and showed a slide of him with a hand on the breast of a statue. And a number of women, in fact, some people, you know, they had one of those, where you could tweet at the same time, and there were some people who commented, you know, this is inappropriate for this format. Following that, there was a reception, and our former resident went to that reception right after these comments made by the president, where she was sexually assaulted in front of a group of people by a fellowship director at an academic program in the United States. And the conversations and the fallout of this have been surprising in many ways, I think, in that there has been a lot of people. So, you know, many of us in women's health would think that this would be pretty straightforward, that this is witnessed by a number of people. There was a letter signed by 100 people to this organization. And the response was very much like, don't worry, we're going to take care of this. And those who called for the resignation of these leaders felt that that would, in terms of just of their leadership positions, felt that that was too unfair. And so within the field, within our field, we have had a lot of people, a lot of women who felt that, you know, this is just too dangerous, you can't touch this. And a number of junior leaders who feel that they need to start a new organization in this subspecialty. I had talked to a fellowship director who said, you know, this organization is too poisoned, there's no room for women leadership, we're gonna start our own. So it's, you know, so when we talk about, is this a new time or is it not? There are women in leadership positions who still feel that it's too dangerous to advocate. And I'd be curious, you know, and sort of the story has been circling around but hasn't really gone anywhere. There's been no professional repercussions to date, although there's a lot of knowledge of these events, as you would imagine in the...
That is very interesting. I do find that younger women are less tolerant of these kinds of violations, and they're less willing to sort of smile or step around and try to accommodate. And I'm glad to see that, because I think you're right that it's very easy. In a lot of organizations, there are a lot of powerful men around, and if you're one of the few women who are also in leadership and in power, it makes it tricky as to, you know, how do you want to preserve your career track upward as well. You don't want to explode your whole organization, and yet these are, in many cases, they're criminal violations. So I'm hopeful that people will have, you know, show some profiles and courage and step out and say, yes, we have to deal with this.
You know, the other profile and courage is the LeadUp, right? You think about how much there must, I got to think that behavior like that, this is not the first time.
Right.
I've got to think that behavior like that was done probably around a bunch of other males, and maybe the right person didn't say, or enough of them didn't say, are you serious? Or so you're a professional and you're doing that kind of thing? So I got to think that the lead-up's the other thing that we also have to get people thinking a little bit about and talking a bit more about. You know, what if in this circumstance, this is the kind of conversation or these are the kinds of actions that happened, how should I respond to that? And how will I respond to that? And what are the ramifications for how I respond to it? But I think that's just as important.
Yeah. A different subspecialty within our organization had a national meeting about 2 months later and sent to all the people at the meeting a code of conduct. Wow. And they had safe people present at the cocktail parties with their cell phones listed and to be under a banner. And
tell us more about that. What that mean? What that mean? Tell us more.
So they put in the email, it said, if you're uncomfortable with the behavior of anyone at the cocktail party, we will have a representative of this organization who is there to protect you. They have cell phones and walkie-talkies. They will be standing in these places. And on the one hand, and a code of conduct, you know, any unwanted physical touching will be, is unacceptable. Please think carefully about the words that you choose. You're in a public forum. So on the one hand, I was sort of horrified that it's necessary. And on the other hand, I was gratified that it sort of acknowledged the events of this other meeting and the harm that was done because of the distrust now on many levels of the people who were present there. Mm-hmm. And this, you know, you talk about a place for anger, you know, so this is my mentee. She's someone who's an advisee of mine, and I'm so angry that her like moment in the sun, you know, your first oral presentation at a national meeting is stolen. And, you know, she was like, I don't want to be that person. I don't want to be known as that, you know, the one who was groped. Like, I don't want that to be my career headline. But, you know, if nothing else will come out of it, I'm willing to go to that. So there's some things in motion, but it still is not a completely satisfying resolution or acknowledgement, I would say.
Mm-hmm. And it's difficult, I think, sometimes. Sometimes the solutions seem to be kind of clunky. You know, do you want somebody standing there with a cell phone or a message that you can run over and talk to them? Because you're right. Do I want to be the person who runs in tattles and everybody look at me and say, you know, what the heck is she doing? You know, so but at least that there is a reaction. That there does seem to be an attempt to grapple with these issues, however difficult they are. That's encouraging. It's just not just, you know, it just goes away. It's nothing. You know, get over it.
Mm-hmm. Wait for a microphone, please. Thank you.
Hi, Karen Edmond. I was doing some research actually on this and came across an article of a professional society, I think it was astronomy, that has an app at the meeting. And I think our professional societies really do need to do these things. And the idea is that it has to be seamless, so it looks like it's a social thing. It can't be that you have to go over under the flag and actually find somebody. In this case, you push the app and somebody comes over to you, picks up the conversation and says, oh, we're supposed to be at the meeting, and gets you out of that situation in a way so that the person who is actually hitting on the young lady generally, doesn't even know that this has been set up ahead of time. And I think that this really does need to be done in our professional societies, because that is a location where this happens quite commonly. I thought the fact that they had an app and had figured this out was actually pretty good.
I see a hand here.
Hi, I'm a student at BUS PhD. Those ideas sound great, but my concern is the men who knowingly or unknowingly were making women feel uncomfortable in those situations still don't know what they were doing, so they're never going to change their behavior. So how can we incorporate a learning opportunity for the man and support for the woman in the situation?
How do we? I mean, I think you're raising this really important piece. That app, the reaction after law, none of those things are going to go to the root of something else, right? Where we don't place people, other human beings, in these circumstances in the first place, where we don't discriminate against other human beings in the first place on real basic levels, before we get to positions of power, before we get to spaces where we've got a level of difference in power over each other. So you're right. What's that thing that we need to do? This is public health, right? Why is this not a public health issue? Right? Talk to me. What have you learned? How does epidemiology train us on this? Right?
Well, yes, of course.
Not your favorite class.
There are a ton of different preventative strategies we can employ.
Yeah, let's talk about a few, though.
Well, I was thinking narrowly at the situation, but you're right. I think I worked in AmeriCorps last year in a high school for kids that were struggling to stay in the public school system in a rural community, and one thing I saw lacking there that would have been extremely impactful was a class or a curriculum change to emphasize relationships and how to learn how to be in a supportive relationship with an intimate partner, how to balance sexual desires with responsibility and independence. All of these things were not talked about for a population that was especially vulnerable to trying to escape from the traumas they face in intimate relationships that are often not supportive. And there wasn't funding in that school to do that. The teachers were overworked as it was, and there wasn't anyone else that could provide it. So.
But was there funding for sex ed?
Not really.
Okay.
They only had enough for the abstinence-only kind of education.
There we go.
Yeah. So I think from a policy perspective, there needs to be an increased funding allotment specifically for not only sexual health, but healthy relationships in high schools across the country, especially places where people maybe aren't getting the role models they should have from their home lives or their communities.
Yeah, and you look a lot at, for example, the material that's beamed to boys very early on. The idea is if you're male, you've got to be in charge. You have to be in control. You can't be a wimp. You can't. The way you deal with women has to be, you know, kind of like the old Rolling Stones song, "I've got you under my thumb." So when when these boys are getting these messages as early as, you know, kindergarten, actually, it's harming their ability to relate on any kind of real human level. So we have to look. This stuff starts really very early. We have to start looking at, you know, how do people relate and each other? How do they get real information rather than these kind of stereotypes that reduce them to, you know, a few ridiculous bullet points.
You see, I think we should roll that back even before high school, and you and I should get together. Let's figure this out. I think that's good. All right, let's get the microphone over here, please. But stick with that for a little bit. How do we attack this? How do we deal with this?
Speaking of attack, I'm also a student at BUSPH. One thing that kind of comes to my mind, at least, you know, especially in like undergrad and as a younger person, you know, whenever me and my friends, like if you go to a club or something, you go to a bar, you go into like this really tightly packed area, someone like grabs you or gropes you or something, I mean, I've punched people because of it. Like, my friends are just like, you know, it's a gut reaction. I don't want to be touched like that. But also, you know, like, that's not obviously a lasting solution as to what is supposed to happen, you know? And you can't exactly, like tell the person in a, you know, like a giant packed rowdy club and be like, this is why this is wrong. You know, like, it's not practical. Like, what do you do in situations like that? You know, because it's wrong to obviously escalate the situation as well, because we need to be civil about this, right? Because it has to be also a discussion at the same time. You can't do that practically.
Well, you raise this really important piece is, you know, so I sometimes get people who ask me, well, what do I do in a moment like that? And look, I think in a moment like that, I'm with you. I find it entirely reasonable to, you know, do that sort of stuff. I would hope I'm better than that, but, you know, it's that sort of stuff. But you think about all those other ways where you've got to do an elbow or nudge, right? Sometimes it's a stare, sometimes it's humor, sometimes it's just straight up empathy with that other person to say, hey, wait, whoa, talk to me a little bit about this. Help me understand why that was the best choice for you. I like asking people that. Tell me why that was the best choice for you. I'm just curious. Well, why did touching my butt become a good choice for you? I just don't understand. There's a lot of ways you could have gotten by here, right? But you know, a little bit of humor, but a little bit of that help me understand kind of stuff. But I think we also should get better at all thinking a little bit about how, as a bystander, we're more than just a bystander, but we're actively able to do those sorts of things. And at the same time, too, how we protect ourselves without necessarily putting ourselves more at risk on those sorts of things, I think are important. And I think you're so right. Sometimes it's a nudge, but sometimes maybe it's a stare, or sometimes it's something else that can be helpful in that sort of circumstance.
Well, I just saw, again, this documentary called The Invisible War, which is incredibly powerful. It's about sexual harassment in the military, largely against women, but also against men. And what became very, very clear was that the company commanders, the people, the unit commanders, they could have stopped this dead to rights, and they didn't. Because it was my buddy, it was my friend, you know, who are you? You're just making up stuff, you want it, this kind of thing. And it was very clear that if the men who had some kind of power would have intervened, the situation would have been very different. So I think that we have to look at those dynamics and start saying that people who have, you know, responsibility for groups have to take more responsibility about these kinds of things that go on, and say, this shall not happen, and it won't happen. If it does happen, there will be consequences, because in this film, almost all the men who did harassment actions against women, some of which were on the level of rape, all got promoted. They went on to have their careers, and the women were they're in terrible shape. One attempted suicide, others had their marriages falling apart. So I think that it's incumbent upon those, and particularly in workplace situations, just to watch out for your people and make sure things like this don't happen.
Hi, my name is Crystal, and I'm also a student here at the School of Public Health. And you were talking about solutions, and Dean Elmore, you were talking about we need to teach kids earlier than high school how to have healthy relationships. I used to be a sexual educator through a federally qualified health center in California, and I was working in a very conservative red county. But I had a door open where I was allowed to come in and teach 5th graders. And it was 5th grade boys and 5th grade girls. They were separate, but they really wanted the curriculum to be focused on assertiveness, how to establish healthy relationships, and have borders, because there were a lot of incidents, or boundaries, because there were a lot of incidents in which the children were being sexually harassed in their communities, which was very unfortunate. But it was awesome to be able to provide that education and to have these conversations with the kids that, you know, they didn't really have anyone else to have them with. So my youngest kids are in 5th grade, my oldest were in community college, and there was only one class in which a teacher asked me to focus on consent. And when that came up, I realized that there was a big gap missing in our curriculum as a center, and we weren't doing justice to everyone, because this was towards the end of my time in that space. And that was the only time that that had happened, which made me really disappointed. Also, reflecting on the conversation that we had last week about gun safety and gun control, American culture is very toxic. Part of this problem.
Tell me more about that. What do you mean by that?
So part of this problem is our culture here in the United States. I think that that's the root of it. How we commercialize sex, how we teach people to be attractive and how to respond to that. The solution to this problem is not apps, is not how to get help to women. The solution is, to raise people to respect each other. If most of the perpetrators are men, to teach them to be sensitive, to be compassionate, to be able to express, and to just see people on an equal playing field instead of objectifying.
When did we start that?
3rd grade.
3rd grade.
It's true, because I just saw a study between comparative study of young men in Amsterdam and young men in the United States. The young men in Amsterdam who had comprehensive sex education from early grades, which also acknowledged that women were human sexual beings and were as entitled to pleasure as men, whereas the American attitude basically was, sexual pleasure is something women give from men or men take from women. So those attitudes started early, and unfortunately in so many schools in areas of our country, as you say, sex education is almost non-existent, or it's very, very rudimentary and simplistic. So yes, I think that's right. These things start early, and you have to get down to the 2nd and 3rd grade level.
I was I remember my children were they were in what most people call a fairly progressive school system, and they sent the note home for to give permission to start talking about sex. And so I said to my wife, "Hey, do you think they'll let me sit in? Or maybe they'll run like real sessions for us so I could see." And of course she said, "Please," my wife's always looking at me saying, "Please don't." Because I said, I'm going to call the principal because I'd like to see it, and I'd like to offer some suggestions, of course. But I've always thought, well, why are we not getting parents more engaged in this too? I know Emily Rothman here, and I think what she's doing with showing children, pornography, and saying, let's talk about what this is and what it's not and how this fits in or not. I wish my children had that kind of sex education. I think that is just far better, more real, more frank, more honest, more where we need to be with this. I wish I had that kind of sex education. I wish I'd had any kind of sex education or any kind of relationship education. That would have been really important. I needed it about my relationship for myself, let alone with other males, and certainly with the other women in my life as well. I needed that, and I wish I had that.
Hi, I'm also a student in the School of Public Health, and I think this conversation about what we can do upstream, what we can do with young children is really awesome, but I also think that something that people need to do in the moment of creating change is start with a critical analysis of the institutions that you're most immediately a part of. And I'm a graduate student. I'm in a pre-professional program. I love BU, but I'm curious about, maybe Dean Elmore, you can offer some thoughts about what BU is doing to prevent sexual harassment within the BU community. And also, I don't want to put you on the spot, Dean Cozier, but anyone who wants to weigh in about how, as the graduate school, as a pre-professional program, how we're arming our students to go into a workforce that is toxic and hostile at times. Women and gender and sexual minorities are more than half of the workforce. And this isn't a matter of diversity or some obscure group. This is literally half the people sitting in the room are more than likely over the course of their career to deal with this. And to date, it hasn't been addressed in any of my classrooms in a direct way, other than being brought up as a comment by a student.
So I'll just real quick, I'll say that I'm not sure Boston University's doing maybe enough, if anything, to prevent. I think that we are doing what we can do, and we can educate people. We can give people information. We can try and push the conversations as best as possible, and hopefully you get them as deep into streams as you can. You know, the hard part is you hope that people will do more with that information. Students will do more with that information. Faculty and staff will do more than just go through the motions of the information that they have put right in front of them. For example, we are about to give, we're about to make sure that all students, all 32,000 of you, undergraduate, graduate, and part-time and full-time, all faculty members, all staff members go through, in some of our cases, an hour, and other cases, a couple of hours as a mandatory sexual misconduct workshop. It's not perfect. It's online. It is one of those things, too, where, sure, people may be going through the motions, but I want people to do more than go through the motion. I want people to struggle a little bit with this. And I think what we can do as an institution is try to get people to struggle as much as possible with this issue, and to own the struggle with this issue, to really own it and say, hey, we are struggling. And I have to own that we are struggling with this as a community of people who call ourselves educated. And what's more, I need to get to a point where we can at least celebrate that struggle and some of the things that we can see as real world examples of how we have gotten better. We've got to be able to say, personally, I've got to be able to say, I can do better than that. As a larger set of communities, we've all got to be able to say, we can do better than that. That's hard. The prevention piece is very, very difficult. We are these people who know how to put information in front of you. We know how to give you sets of information, but I'm not sure we're quite there about prevention as an institution. And I think that what we've got to do is to stay real hard on this, to really struggle with this over time. And I hope that over time, if enough of us are doing it, and if we get enough of it outside of the institution itself, that's going to be the right place for us as people who will be in leadership roles in the place. So do I wish we could do more? Of course, but I'm not sure what that is. That's the hard part about it. And I'm not sure how we reach everyone we need to really reach with regard to this as well.
Yeah, a few years ago we had an incident with the hockey team where there was allegations there was a real rape culture around the hockey team. There were assaults. And I think that there was an effort at that point to really, there were meetings, there were guidelines, there were lots of things that were done, and I think those were all helpful. I don't know how well they've continued, but certainly these things need to be ongoing because they're ongoing questions.
And we certainly get tremendous pushback, I'll tell you that. If I get maybe just a dozen pushback letters on this a day, it's a good day with this sort of stuff. The pushback is tremendous on this stuff. Yeah, I'm not surprised, but it's disappointing. It really is.
I would just also add that following what the university is doing, we're starting with that School of Public Health as well, starting with faculty and eventually students and staff. But I agree, we are kind of the bubble here, you know, and what happens outside of that, we, you know, would hope to partner with placement, you know, agencies or situations where our students will go that have a reasonable culture, but we're limited in being able to extend what we have here out there. So preparing students for this, or preparing students for any of the horrible things that they could, you know, possibly encounter in humankind, it's a daunting task, and it's something that there's no one lesson for. It's often having to bump into it over and over again and figuring out how to survive it. But I agree with you, Ken. I wish that it were easier to have a more prescribed path and know that that was going to work and that would be enough. But we just have to keep going at it over and over again.
Let's give you a shot.
You know, I was, before I took up the occupation of coming to BUSPH interesting sessions like this, I was an executive. And my experience is that in terms of corporations, they typically rot from the top. And the example this lady over here gave about this industry association where some Neanderthal would get up on the stage and say something like that would it's not surprising at all that her student had a problem in the cocktail party. So I think that these kinds of things, in a corporation which I would, or an institution of any kind, which I would distinguish from people operating in their private lives, going to a bar where basically you're protected by the laws of the United States. In corporations or institutions, you can have rules. And my experience is that a lot of companies didn't have rules, and as a result, there were no norms of behavior that were prescribed. So what we used to do in situations like this is we would say what things you can't do, and if you do them, this is what happens to you, up to and including termination. So in my job, I would, as a senior officer of this place, periodically there would be a claim of some form of sexual harassment or other bad deeds, and I would interview the participants because the lawyer said that you as the president are in the best position to adjudicate these accusations. And I found that they were very challenging sometimes. It was clear what the accusation was, and it was clear what the response of the supposedly offending party was, but it was very hard to prove or understand two things. One, was it a grievous enough offense, and was it just in the eyes of the accuser? And two, did it really happen as prescribed? And I found that to be a pretty challenging thing. But I think companies and institutions ought to have rules about this. I suspect they did now. I suspect Weinberg's company did not, would be my guess.
You know, I certainly find that here at this institution, we got a lot of rules, and we got rules about all this sort of stuff, but it has not necessarily lessened the number of instances we have to deal with. You know, and right, there have to be consequences, but there we go again, we're reacting after the fact, right? We're reacting, and I know I would love us to not be in the reaction mode and for us to treat human beings the way they need to be treated.
Hi, again. I really liked what you were saying, Dean Elmore, about changing the, at least orientation of all students at BU to have an online component to their beginning. But as you said, it's online, it's 1 hour, 2 hours, something like that. How much is that really going to change the course of their life?
It's very good, by the way. I've gone through it. It actually is very good if you take your time to do it.
I'm personally of one that clicks through those slides as quickly as possible and takes the quiz.
By the way, we put a timer on it, so you can't. So.
Yeah. Regardless of those things, though, I feel like there's a lot missing when you're not talking to someone else or a group of other people. Mm-hmm. And at the college I went to before this, we didn't have like live workshops for every student at that point when I went through, but we did have a live workshop mandatory for any varsity athlete. So every sports team had to go through this. It was several hours. It involved a lot of like workshop building stuff where people are presented with a question and they're required to respond to it. Sometimes in like a live role-playing situation, sometimes just with an opinion. But it really caused people to start questioning what they believed in, what their habits were in navigating different social spaces, be it like a party, a sports locker room, campus, classrooms, anything like that. So being policy-minded, I'm wondering how much more money or resources would it cost BU to roll out some live workshop setting for this information instead of having an online module that probably also costs a considerable amount of money to create. And I know it probably will cost more, and I know that BU is doing other things like this huge environmental climate justice overhaul and plan that they're doing. They kept up advertising. They just built a $100 million integrated life sciences building on campus. But proportional to what this workshop would entail, if it was, again, a one-time thing for everyone to go through a couple hours a day, rooms of 30 people maybe on average, how much would that actually cost? Because I think that's more reasonable than we might imagine.
You know, we do something like that, what you're describing, but we do it for our undergraduate students as they come into the place. Mm-hmm. You know, there's this assumption, I'll admit, that we make is that you as public health students, you as graduate students, you don't have time for that. and that you don't need that, that you're in this maturity space where you can get by with the online piece, or you can get by with more of the conversation, discussion, or in your classes that could happen. And maybe we need to really rethink that assumption a bit. Maybe we should offer to you what we do offer for our undergraduates in terms of this. It's a lot of time, and no one wants to sacrifice their time to any particular issue. And what's more, everyone else comes along and says, well, I'd like another 3 hours too, right? And so it's trying to prioritize and balance these off. And I think that what you've done, what you've all done, is you've given me this great, well, I don't know how great of an idea it's going to be when I try to talk my staff into this, but I think you're absolutely right. There's got to be this way that we not only get the information, but we talk to each other about it, and we do it more immediately, and we get opportunities to do it a bit more often than in the 2 minutes after we all break up. And I'd like to look at ways that we can incorporate that even for graduate students to be able to do the same sort of thing. But I think what happens is there are a lot of assumptions that we make about the level of your knowledge, the level of your skill level around this issue, around harassment. We make some assumptions that maybe we should stop making and see if we can elbow out some time. I think the cost is really the time and not so much the actual doing or anything like that. I think it's really the time that's the real factor here.
Do we have data on, where the most problem areas are? Are in fact the graduate students more mature and less involved in these issues?
From my standpoint, I see all discipline, undergraduate and grad. I think I see just as much by way of sexual harassment, I'm going to say sexual misconduct, right, with graduate students as I do with undergraduate students. Just as much. I think it's about even part. It manifests itself in different ways, but it's there. It's there. And obviously we see it with faculty.
Right, sure.
Right? And we obviously see it with staff as well.
Just one further
Sure.
quick comment.
You want to come up here? I mean,
BU and many other universities across the country pride themselves on being diverse in their undergraduate and graduate populations. And if we pride ourselves on being diverse, how can we assume that everyone coming into the school shares some base level of sexual and healthy relationship education? I think that's totally erroneous. So because of that, and it's good to have diversity and we should continue, I think we do need a mandatory, across the board, maybe minimalist at first, but live education in training everyone to at least be able to talk about these things. They're not going to be heroes, but at least they have this icebreaker that allows them to talk to their peers more honestly, like you were saying earlier in the talk. Because everyone's different. There's people from all over the world in our program, and who knows what they were taught growing up or before they came here.
As I said, it's an assumption, and we all make that assumption.
And there are difficult, difficult cases. For example, I'm a friend of Tom Ashbrook's, who was recently fired from WBUR. He was accused of sexual harassment. They investigated and they found he wasn't guilty of sexual harassment, but he was guilty of bullying some of his employees, and more so some of the younger women than the guys that had been around. And the question is, and Tom attempted to say, look, I'm a tough boss. Sometimes I would get angry. Sometimes I probably would bully people, but I did it because I love what we're doing, and I think what we're doing is great. And so these kind of issues really are hard to weigh. Was there harassment? Was there bullying? Was there a boss who was too tough but who was doing things for the greater good, et cetera? I mean, I and my friends have argued this 6 ways to Sunday. So these aren't easy questions sometimes.
I think I saw some hands over here.
I wanted to share, I think, starting with curriculum, educating everyone. Sorry, my name is Mary, and I'm also a BUSPH student. I think having a curriculum like that could be beneficial, and I know you said also that in some way there will be moving forward, like education about sexual harassment or bystander intervention going into that. But I do think because of so many diverse backgrounds and different experiences you may have had before coming, really one of the things we don't focus on is that I think there can be reconciliation after an event happens, like sexual harassment. And I don't think that we teach men to apologize, and I don't think we know what a good apology even looks like. Like looking at all the, I don't know, like celebrities who have been accused of sexual harassment recently, there's been a lot of denial of allegations, there's been no apology. And so I think that could be a good step within an education curriculum. If something happens, if you do something incorrectly, whether you are male or female, however you identify, I think it's really important to know how to apologize and know how to admit a wrongdoing.
Atone.
That's an interesting point, because again, the image that we give our young boys is you don't apologize. You know, you fight for what's right, and you stick up for yourself, and you don't let anyone push you around. An apology doesn't really come into this narrative very often. So I think that's also a part of the issue too.
You know, there's a piece to also atonement and apology where you have to know to be able to do so, or you have to realize in order to be able to do that. And sometimes that realization might come a little later, or it might come more immediately, but it is one of those kinds of things. Give you an example with me in my life. I recently was asked to be on a panel of 10 at a conference, and what I did not do, which I usually do, but I no excuse, I didn't do. I didn't look to see who the other people were on the panel. And on the panel, there were a number of people of color and only 3 women. And for me, you know, if I had taken the time, I probably would have said something to the convener, to the organizer about that. So, you know, before I started, I said, you know, I have to atone that I did not do what I was supposed to do here. And what I was supposed to do was to take a look at that and say something about it and be able to weigh beforehand, before I walked on the stage, that was probably going to be something that would be problematic for me and for my reputation, but also for all the other people out there who could have been invited to even have my seat as a piece of it. So that was one of those things where I felt a real need to atone for, especially as someone who tries to be in tune with that sort of thing. And you have to be able to realize that, and you have to be able to do it, and you have to be able to be confident being able to do that kind of a thing. But it's there. And you know, I'm not proud that I let that happen, but it is one of those things that you have to be mindful of. But people have to know it first. That's that hard piece about this, which goes back to education, which goes back to asking the questions, which goes back to having people in your life that might be able to not necessarily call you out about these kinds of things, but at least to say, is that your best option? Is that our best option? Is it our best option to continue to participate or be a part of these kinds of things too?
And sunshine is often the best disinfectant when people know that these actions will have consequences, and that these things will be talked about and they'll be discussed. It will no longer be something as hidden under the ground and you don't have to pay any attention to. I think that's the beginning of changing the culture, that it's not like that it is inevitable that these things will fade away and the old practices will simply remain, but we can change things.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about culture and pop culture and art and music and everything else. When we think about changing culture, you know, is it okay? So I saw Kobe Bryant, for example, received an Oscar recently. And some people will say there is no way he should get something like an Oscar given his past, and a past that includes, some people will certainly argue, rape. So he cannot, and we should not feed him or do anything like that. I don't care how good it is. And there are any number of songs and music and other things that we do to recognize people, whether it be to purchase or buy their product, or to recognize them through awards. I mean, where's the room there? And put that alongside this other thing too. Well, people will say too, there is no room for forgiveness. There is no room for mistake here. What do you think? What do you think?
It's difficult. You know, I sometimes feel guilty when I go see Woody Allen movies. I like Woody Allen movies, but I sure don't like Woody Allen and what he did. You know, on the other hand, you know, do we say that all art has to be done by people who are perfect? And so I think there's really dicey issues there. Certainly, I don't think we give an Oscar to somebody who's, you know, been convicted of rape. But then you get down to all these gray areas, and there are many people who've given awards and who've created wonderful things that have also been anything but admirable in their private lives. So I think that this is something we need to talk about and discuss, because what are the rules now? We don't know what they are.
So I don't really know the answer to that question, but I do think that you need to take into consideration if these people who are winning awards and being praised have actually been punished for what they did. So like, I don't think that Kobe Bryant ever, you know, did jail time or any, you know, or issued an apology. I don't know about Kobe Bryant specifically, but I mean, there are a lot of people who, you know, are accused of doing something horrible, and it's not that people are just uncomfortable about supporting them maybe artistically because, oh, they're people who, you know, did something bad. It's also they did something bad, but nothing ever came of it. Like, they weren't punished, they didn't apologize, they didn't. So I just think that should be taken into consideration, because if you do something wrong and then try to make amends or do something that shows that you aren't going to do it again, and also that you acknowledge the severity of what you have done, and I don't know, maybe even if you were punished or go to jail, like, I think that's different than if you have someone who, you know, was never punished or never acknowledged what they did. And I personally I don't know yet if I want to support the art of people who in other parts of their lives have maybe done some very horrible things. So like, I don't know how to answer this question, but I do know that I would feel more strongly if I was supporting someone who, you know, never actually had to not come to terms, but had to like admit they did something wrong or got punished for something they did wrong. So I just think that might be a nuance in it too. So yeah.
We've had any number of people who've resigned positions, been run out of industries, that sort of thing. When do you think is the right time for them to, how long before they can come back?
I don't know. I also think it's worth taking into consideration like the severity of what they've done. So there's been like a lot of talk about, especially because of the Me Too movement, so there's like Harvey Weinstein and then there's Aziz Ansari. And you know, some people are saying that, you know, Harvey Weinstein's career should definitely suffer because of what he did and the number of people he hurt. But I don't know if anyone's familiar with what happened with Aziz Ansari, but he was accused not of, you know, he didn't rape anyone, but he made a girl feel very uncomfortable, and he did, some people were saying that he did sexually harass someone, if not assault, but sexually harass. And so I think it's also worth thinking about, you know, the scale, you know, of what they've done and how many people they've hurt before trying to figure out, you know, oh, how long before we forgive this person? Or, and also taking into consideration, like, the survivors. And I think their voice, I don't know if it, I don't want to say necessarily, well, I want to say it matters more almost in this conversation because they're the people who have been directly impacted by what these people have done. But we should definitely include them in the conversation as to like, how long before we forgive this person? Should we forgive this person, et cetera, et cetera? So I don't know, I don't have any concrete answers myself.
No, but it's a really good question because certainly when you look at Harvey Weinstein, he has over many years created, you know, I mean, several incidents of rape, lots of instances of sexual harassment, and this was a major league harasser. And I think it certainly ought to be a long, long time before Harvey Weinstein is if ever permitted back into the company of you know, acclaimed filmmakers. Yeah. Then you have these other incidents that are somewhat smaller, like there was you know, in the case of Ansari, we had a discussion on that in our class, and it looked like it was a really bad date. And that he was kind of you know, he didn't perform very well, and he was, I guess he was basically a jerk. And what do you do in that situation, you know, where there was no claim made of assault or everything was consensual, but it made a woman feel extremely uncomfortable. Those are the things that are so difficult to try to figure out.
Yeah. Can I throw one thing in there too? I guess the two words that come in its being, you know, kind of devil's advocate, but we can do that here, is kind of due process. What happens at the end of that? So I guess with the Kobe Bryant, I mean, I have no great feelings for him, but he was acquitted.
He was.
Right, he was acquitted.
And so you won't get an apology out of him, because he will say, I didn't do anything, and a jury found me not guilty. So, I mean, so it's a challenge. It's really a challenge for us to figure out, you know, is there a line, and you mentioned, Ken, forgiveness. Where do we go with that? You know, so I can admit that with some of the things that the turmoil that's happened at like PBS, for example, thinking that the only men left there will be like, you know, Curious George and Arthur the Aardvark after a while, right? I mean, so where do we take it? Where does it go? Do we shut down, you know, and show only certain shows, or kick everybody out, or, you know, due process? What happens? And we don't usually hear the other side, too, you know, so, and claims.
And we have a president who admits in a tape that he grabs women's privates and seems to have enjoyed it and has utterly no remorse whatsoever. How do we know that kind of culture?
And no repercussions.
No repercussions
at all.
See, now you all got to start it now, right?
Like 10 minutes to go, yeah, right?
Well, you know, one of the things that you know, if there's any positiveness in this sadness and this terror that's happening, or has been happening, you know, one of the things I see is that we as groups of people have come together to say, we don't do that around here. And because we don't do that around here, you can't have your livelihood around here. And you do need to go and figure this out, go into the woods. So there's a level at which there is more community engagement to say, no, we're just not going to have that here. And we may not throw you in a jail, but we will imprison you in some way. So there's been a really interesting thing that I've been watching about that in terms of how that has moved, shunned, or maybe gotten to more of an original way that we can take care of these deep-seated issues. We will do these ourselves. You can't be a part of our society. We won't count you as civilized if you are discriminating against people, if you're raping people, if you are harassing and assaulting people.
Hi, my name is Indigo. I'm also a student at BUSPH. I really like bringing back in the due process conversation. I think that's something we're struggling as a society to do at the legal level, but it'd be really interesting to bring into a concept of like personal or casual due process, like how, like with Aziz Ansari, or individuals dealing within their own lives these instances of relationships gone bad. What does it look like to have personal due process where we engage in honest conversation and vulnerability and apologies that are sincere and reparations that coincide with the severity of the action, and how do we as a society, as a culture, talk about what due process looks like outside of the law, because there are things that happen that aren't illegal but are still wrong. And I think that's part of where the education comes in, you know, that starting that movement young. But I just like the word due process and how we can maybe expand how that's defined outside of just the legal realm.
I love that. You know, and I think there's this aspect of what you mentioned too, that if we do that ourselves, part of what we have to be prepared to do is to say, we will not shut you off forever, right? You are still a part of this community.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, the accountability doesn't mean you go away. It means you're still a part of us here, and we're still willing to forgive and put up with you for a little bit, but you're still a part of that. And I think that's the hard part for us to be able to do as individuals, is to be able to say, my retribution goes but so far. The ways, I have to find these ways for people to give back, and I have to find ways for these people to rehabilitate themselves. And see, now we're starting to sound like prison reform here, but you know, it's got some elements to it where the community makes those decisions.
Yeah. And I think that's why it's such a difficult conversation, and why people are so afraid to come to the table, is because right now the only expectation is that you will be judged or shunned, and there's no room for something beyond that.
And you'll hear people say, I still got to work and live in this community, right? Okay, so it looks like time-wise, let's go. One, two, three.
Hadn't spoken.
Hi, I'm Michelle. I'm actually just a staff member, not a student, so a rarity, I guess. But one example to continue your conversation and your comment is that I found interesting is the Dan Harmon situation. And I wonder how many people are aware of this. This is a creator of Community, the TV show and other television shows, where he had a former employee, I believe it was a staff writer, but I could be wrong, come out and say, you made me feel uncomfortable in these situations. And they engaged in a dialogue online through multiple mediums where he took the opportunity to discuss what he had done and evaluate himself and apologize. And then the person who had accused him of this act, and he fully accepted it, had come back and say, I accept your apology. And so I don't know that, I'm not saying it's like something to hold on high, but I am looking forward to seeing more and more situations where we have the victims coming back and seeing that discussion back and forth. And I felt like this was a good example of that. He has not been shunned for his community, but I see that he has become even more vocal about these things and how it came to be that he had these actions, and admitting that he didn't see women as people and evaluating himself, but using it as a discussion. He may be a unique one because he's definitely someone who seems to use himself as an example to be kind of downtrodden and self-effacing, but I thought it was a good example for this.
And then you're next.
Yeah, so bring it back to the politician side of things, right? Like, for example, Al Franken, Democratic senator, all his whole sexual harassment and sexual misconduct allegations kind of came out, and, you know, he pretty promptly apologized, stepped down, and there are so many people on the other side of the aisle who have been accused and have not done these things, right? Some people have been, you know, socially punished for it, like, that guy who was running for office in Alabama when Doug Jones.
Yeah, Judge Moore.
Yeah, that guy. And like obviously like, he got socially punished for it. But I mean, if you start like a enumerated list of these people who have, you know, been accused of these things, and if they kind of add up, what's supposed to happen to them? Are we just supposed to uproot like half of Congress and then replace them with more people, and then like the election process is so long, and then also like what about background checks on the people that are running for office, you know? Like when, obviously it's not on the burden of the oppressed to speak out, but it sure does help, but it's not, it shouldn't be on them to have to speak out for these people to not get into office, right? So like what is that supposed to look like, especially when it comes to due process? Are we supposed to literally lose like half of our government?
Well, I think the Al Franken, it was a good example because he did not get due process. There was supposed to be a senatorial hearing to look into some of these issues. And I think what happened was that the Democrats were so worried that they weren't going to get tossed into the same pot as Roy Moore that they felt they had to be, you know, more Caesar than Caesar, and to instantly demand Franken's resignation. I would have preferred more due process because when you look at, for example, the picture that was published, it was a stupid joke The woman had on a flak jacket. He may not even have been touching her. And it was dumb and idiotic. And of course, it was some years ago. So, you know, was that to me an immediate, you must leave Congress this instant thing? And my question was, I think there's some room where there's this question. You need a little bit more debate, a little more discussion. What really did happen? What really went on? And do we go instantly to the, you know, the execution, or are there other circumstances? I found that bothersome that he did not get due process.
Well, you know, all right, let me be a contrarian. Sure he did. He got an opportunity to be heard. And the public said, you know, given the time, given the circumstance right now, this is very unacceptable, and it is incredibly unacceptable for someone who is a U.S. Senator. And so, you know, if you think about what due process is, it's a simple kind of thing. And maybe, you know, I go back to my friend's comment here, where it's about personally thinking about what this means, not legally, but the legal stuff, right? The lawyers will do all they can to convolute this thing and kill this sort of stuff. I'm a lawyer, so I'm saying it. I'm saying it. We do all we can. On a personal level, it's the opportunity to be heard. It's the conversation. It's the reckoning. It's the rendering of it all out. And I don't know. Contrarian, I think Al Franken had a chance to say his piece. He had all kinds of ways. I think we've got to look to.
But he did apologize.
And then he got public disdain for it, right?
Did he get public disdain, or did he get a committee with
congressional disdain?
Because congressional disdain.
His peers,
or senatorial.
His peers said, "Unacceptable, Al. You got to take a walk. You're messing us all up here. It's problematic." Yep, I know. Yep, you're a comedian. You were a comedian. I get it. You had an opportunity to do it. Yep, you didn't touch her. You know what, though? When you're at this kind of level of a job, we don't find that acceptable. I think he had a chance to explain himself. I think he had a chance to say his piece. And that's what due process is, a chance to say our piece. Ultimately, the public, the people have to decide this stuff.
But wasn't it a political calculation by his peers that really led to his...
I'm talking personal, not politics.
Okay.
I'm talking personal stuff.
I'd say, well, we started off talking about Anita Hill, and we've ended sort of talking about Al Franken, and they were both similar processes. They, you know, the congressional, or the Democrats with Anita Hill made a calculation, and the Democrats with Al Franken made a calculation. What type of due process we can argue there, but
and the big question is, how much process does anyone do?
And how much process? So this will be our last comment, because we're at
all right. Thank you. I think this due process question is very interesting. Earlier on, I advocated that organizations ought to have rules, and people who violate the rules should suffer the consequences. But there also is this issue of changing the rules after the fact. And put yourself in the position of poor Harvey Weinstein. You know, I'm not a big fan of his, but when you were 15 years old, you knew about the casting couch. All this stuff had been going on for years and years in multiple organizations. One of his best friends is Hillary Clinton, and a lot of the people on the progressive left were big supporters of his. Now all of a sudden they're changing the rules of the game, and I'm a bad guy. How did I go from such a great guy that everybody loved me to a bad guy all of a sudden?
Well, I think there are plenty of people who would say it was always wrong. It was just always wrong. It was always unacceptable. I don't care what the society, there are a lot of things we were doing 15 years ago, 30 years ago, 100 years ago, and 125 years ago that were wrong. They weren't right. There's a reason why we don't do them anymore, because they weren't right. So I think there are plenty of people who will say, nah, Harvey, man, you are a person who purports to be a thinking person. You are a person who you've been engaged in moral conversations and questions. You're an educated person. You should know this is wrong. You knew it was wrong. You knew it was wrong when you learned it, and you certainly knew it was wrong when you were a 67-year-old. So, you know, it's hard to give people a pass for that sort of stuff.
Yeah, and you knew when you raped somebody. If Harvey just done a pat on the tush here and there over the past 20 years, okay, it might have been different. But his allegations were really bad. They were very serious.
But even the pat on the tushy, look, I'm in a position now. I'm so fortunate that I'm in this executive position. The way I behaved 15 years ago is very different than the way that I behave now. In part, why? Because I'm a professional, right? And by the way, even 15 years ago, I wasn't patting anybody on the tushy.
Right.
But I was probably more flirty than I am right now. I probably was a little more touchy-feely than I am right now. I understand that as a professional and as someone who purports to be a professional in a leadership space, I can't act the way that I acted then, and I can't act the way that I act at home. Because my wife will tell you I'm a moron, but I can't act that way, and I got to know the difference. So, for someone like Harvey Weinstein, I either say that is tremendous incompetence, or it is such hubris with your resources that I find it unbelievable that even the pat on the tushy gets by in this sort of thing.
Yes, but my point is it was endemic for that entire industry, I believe.
And a whole industry can be wrong. Declare the whole industry wrong and out of sorts.
My point is they were playing by the rules that were in effect at the time, and
they
much
weren't
of
rules.
it not illegal.
They weren't rules.
They were the rules of the boys' club. I mean, what you saw was there were no women directors, very few women heads of studios, very few women had any power in that, that business, which was a lot about sex and glamour. So the rules were very much skewed to one group who had all the power against the group who didn't. So it wasn't that the rules changed, it was that the rules were always pretty toxic to begin with, and they just stayed the same.
But they were the rules.
Can I ask just one question before we end? How should our society treat President Clinton?
How should our society treat President Clinton?
Well, that's been a question.
That's been a question. Well, I do think a lot of people gave Clinton a pass, and in essence said, he's doing good things, he's making good policies, his policy for women is great, and so we're going to give him a pass, and we probably shouldn't have. Much the way that a lot of the people on the right give Trump a pass because he's doing what they want him to do. And I think that there is a higher morality out there we need to adhere to.
But I'd also say it wasn't like Bill Clinton got away with, murder. He was impeached.
He got impeached,
He was impeached. He wasn't removed from office, but he paid a price. He happened to also be an incumbent, and a lame duck at the time, so he couldn't run again. But
he's doing pretty well.
He's doing okay, yeah. But we have a chief executive who right now is saying, what about it? So.
I think we should look at Bill Clinton as an examination of ourselves. He is yet another example of how we will let people benefit from that kind of behavior, from seeing human beings in that way, from treating women that way. I think this is, when we talk about culture, Bill Clinton is yet one more example of the uphill fight that we have with ourselves to accept or not accept that sort of thing. And clearly we accept that. We still lionize this person, we still support this person, we still pay incredible amounts of money to see this person, and so I think he should be viewed in a deeper examination of ourselves and who we are and what we think we're about. And that's why Donald Trump should come as no surprise to us, because we still have not moved the needle. And so I think that's how we should examine Bill Clinton, the long line of how we refuse to examine ourselves.
So with that, I would like to thank everybody who attended and has stayed.
You did good.
You did very well. Thank you for participating. And I would love to thank Professor Rivers. Thank you so much for your participation and your insight. And Ken Elmore, Dean Elmore, thank you for leading this. And I think there's some snacks in the back, and we can keep the conversation going. Thank you.
Thanks,
Great. Thank you.